Good evening and welcome. Whether you're settling down in Miami, Ohio, New York City, Florida, or finding rest elsewhere in the world, thank you for being here tonight. Listen for a moment. Can you hear that? The gentle sound of rain falling softly in the distance. Tonight, that rain will accompany us as we journey to a small mountain community in Northern California, where rain once fell on abandoned cabins and unanswered questions. Before we begin, if you appreciate these carefully researched stories designed for peaceful rest, please consider subscribing. Tonight, we travel to the Sierra Nevada mountains in 1981, to a forgotten railroad town called Ketty, to a place where families came seeking affordable housing in converted resort cabins, to Cabin 28, where a single mother named Sue Sharp was trying to build a new life for her 5 children, far from the husband she'd left behind in Connecticut. On the morning of April 12, 1981, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp came home from a sleepover next door and walked into a scene of horror that would haunt California for more than 4 decades. What happened in Cabin 28 that night remains one of the most brutal and baffling unsolved crimes in American history. So settle deeper into your pillows. Listen to the rain falling outside our story. Take a slow, calming breath. And let's journey together to the mountains of Northern California, where the answers to what happened on that April night remain hidden in shadows and silence. In July 1979, 34-year-old Glenna Susan Sharp, everyone called her Sue, made a decision that would change everything. She was leaving her husband James Sharp in Connecticut, leaving behind the abuse, the unhappiness, the life that had become unbearable. She was taking her 5 children and starting over. Sue had been born in Springfield, Massachusetts, on March 29, 1945. She'd married, raised children, tried to build a traditional life. But James was abusive, and Sue had finally reached her limit. She packed what belongings would fit in her vehicle, gathered her children, 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, and 5-year-old Greg, and headed west. They were going to California, where Sue's brother Don lived. It was a cross-country journey filled with hope and uncertainty in equal measure. What would they find in California? Could Sue support 5 children on her own? Would this really be a fresh start or just a different kind of struggle? When they arrived in Northern California, Sue's brother helped them get settled. They first rented a small trailer at the Claremont Trailer Village in Quincy, a space far too cramped for a family of 6. Sue enrolled in a federal education program, taking business classes to improve her employment prospects. She received some child support from James, about $250 a month, and supplemented it with welfare and food stamps. Money was tight, but Sue was determined. The rain falls softly in the distance as we imagine Sue in those early months, a woman in her mid-30s starting completely over, trying to be both mother and father to 5 children who'd already been through so much upheaval. By fall 1980, Sue heard about better housing options. The Ketty Resort, about 5.5 miles north of Quincy in the Sierra Nevada mountains, had once been a thriving vacation destination. Families had come there for decades to enjoy the natural beauty, the streams, the forests, the clean mountain air. But by 1980, tourism had dried up. The resort had fallen into disrepair, and the owners had converted the 33 rustic cabins into low-income housing, renting them out for about $170 a month. One cabin in particular caught Sue's attention, Cabin 28. It was much larger than the trailer, with multiple bedrooms, space for the children to spread out. And it had an interesting history. It had most recently been occupied by Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas himself before he vacated the property. If it was good enough for the sheriff, Sue thought, it would be good enough for her family. In November 1980, the Sharp family moved into Cabin 28. It wasn't fancy. The cabins were basic, rustic structures with no electricity in some rooms, minimal insulation, and the wear and tear of decades. But it was home. The children quickly adapted to mountain life. Behind the cabins were woods to explore, a stream for playing, railroad tracks for adventure. They made friends with other children living in the neighboring cabins. It was a tight-knit community of families, all struggling financially but looking out for one another. 15-year-old John took over the unfinished room downstairs, off a small utility area in the partial basement. Since there were no indoor stairs, he used the back staircase or came through the front door to access the rest of the house. Sheila, 14, was the responsible older daughter who helped her mother with the younger children. Tina, 12, was in that middle child space, old enough to have freedom but young enough to still need guidance. Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, were typical boys, full of energy and mischief. Sue continued her business classes and took a part-time job at the Quincy Elks Lodge. Her classmates described her as a good student who earned excellent grades, though she tended to be a loner. She wasn't someone who made close friends easily, but she was friendly with neighbors and other parents at the resort. Despite her difficult circumstances, Sue managed to date occasionally, going to a local bar called the Back Door to drink beer and play pool. The rain continues its gentle pattern as we picture Sue in these months, a woman who'd fled domestic violence, who was working hard to provide for her children, who was slowly building a new life in this mountain community. Among the neighbors at Ketty Resort were Martin and Marilyn Smart, who lived in cabin 26, just 2 doors down from the Sharps. Martin, who sometimes went by Marty, was a Vietnam veteran who had served 2 tours and was dealing with PTSD. He worked as a cook at the Ketty Resort but was known to have a volatile temper. Marilyn attended the same typing class as Sue, and the 2 women became friendly. Marilyn confided in Sue about her troubles. Martin was abusive, she said. He had violent outbursts. He cheated on her. Marilyn's son from a previous relationship, Justin, 12 years old, often stayed in the Smart cabin. Sue, who had her own experience with an abusive husband, gave Marilyn advice. She should leave Martin. She shouldn't accept the abuse. She deserved better. It was well-intentioned advice from one woman who'd escaped domestic violence to another still trapped in it. But according to later accounts, Martin heard about Sue's counsel to his wife, and he was furious. He saw Sue as interfering in his marriage, as poisoning Marilyn against him. This anger would later be seen as a possible motive for what came next. A few weeks before April 1981, Martin had been at a VA hospital in Reno, Nevada, seeking treatment for his PTSD. There he met another veteran, John Bo Bubaid, a man with his own troubled past. Bo had a criminal record that included bank robbery and time in prison. He'd allegedly had ties to organized crime in Chicago. He'd been at the VA hospital after a suicide attempt and treatment for epilepsy. When Martin left the hospital, he brought Bo back to Ketty with him. Bo moved into the Smart cabin, sleeping on the couch, an extra presence in the already tense household. Neighbors would later describe how Bo seemed to have developed an attraction to Sue Sharp. He'd allegedly approached her romantically twice, and both times she'd rejected him. By early April 1981, tensions at the Ketty Resort were simmering beneath the surface of everyday life. Sue Sharp was working hard, raising her children, encouraging her neighbor to leave an abusive marriage. Martin Smart was angry, volatile, recently unemployed after being fired from his cooking job a few weeks earlier. Bo Bubaid was living in their cabin, nursing his own resentments. The rain falls steadily now as we approach the date that would change everything. April 11th, 1981. Saturday, April 11th, 1981, dawned bright and clear in Ketty. It was early spring in the Sierra Nevada, that time of year when winter's grip was finally loosening and warmer days were beginning to appear. For the Sharp family, it was a day like any other. Running errands, spending time with friends, the ordinary rhythms of life. Around 11:30 that morning, Sue, Sheila, and Greg drove from the home of their friends, the Meeks family, to pick up Rick, who was attending baseball tryouts at Gansner Field in Quincy, several miles away. On their way, they spotted John and his friend Dana Hall Wingate hitchhiking near the mouth of the canyon from Quincy back toward Ketty. Dana Wingate was 17 years old, a year or 2 older than John. He was a friend who often spent time at Cabin 28, comfortable enough with the Sharp family that he'd stay over frequently. Sue pulled over and gave the boys a ride, driving them about 6 miles to Ketty and dropping them at home. A couple of hours later, around 3:30 in the afternoon, John and Dana hitchhiked back to Quincy. They may have had plans to visit other friends there. Witnesses later reported seeing the two teenage boys in Quincy's downtown area that afternoon. It was the last confirmed sighting of either of them alive. The rain that falls in our story matches the rain that would later fall on Keddy, washing away evidence, obscuring the truth. That evening, Sheila had plans to spend the night at the Seabolt family's cabin, Cabin 27, right next door to her own home. It was a common arrangement. The children at Keddy Resort regularly had sleepovers with friends and neighbors. Sheila left Cabin 28 shortly after 8 p.m., walking the short distance to the Seabolts' place. Tina had been at the Seabolts earlier, watching television with the family. Around 9:30 p.m., she asked what time it was, and then headed back home to Cabin 28. That simple decision, to go home rather than stay with her sister next door, would determine Tina's fate. Back at Cabin 28, Sue was home with Rick, 10, and Greg, 5. Justin Smart, Martin and Marilyn's son, was also there, staying overnight as he sometimes did. The younger boy's friend Justin was probably in Rick and Greg's room. John and Dana, having returned from Quincy earlier, were also at the cabin. Sometime that evening, Marilyn Smart later claimed, she and Martin and Bo went to the backdoor bar. Marilyn said she dropped the two men off at the bar around 11 p.m. Before going, they'd stopped at Cabin 28 and invited Sue to join them. Sue declined. She had the young boys to look after, and besides, she probably had no interest in spending the evening with Martin, knowing his anger toward her. Marilyn said that when she left Martin and Bo at the bar, they were angry about Sue's refusal to join them. Other witnesses at the back door later said the men had been behaving belligerently. Marilyn claimed she went home to Cabin 26 and went to sleep. What happened next is shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. A couple living in Cabin 16 reported being awakened around 1:15 a.m. by what sounded like muffled screaming. But in a place where sounds often carried through thin cabin walls, and where children sometimes played late, they didn't investigate. They went back to sleep. The Seabolt family in Cabin 27, where Sheila was sleeping just 15 feet from her own home, heard nothing. The walls between the cabins, the sounds of wind in the trees, the isolation of mountain living, all of it conspired to muffle whatever horror was unfolding in Cabin 28. Inside that cabin, at some point between late Saturday night and early Sunday morning, 3 people were attacked with brutal ferocity. Sue Sharp, 36 years old. John Sharp, 15. Dana Wingate, 17. The killers, and investigators would later believe there were at least 2 based on the nature of the crimes, brought or found multiple weapons. 2 knives, 1 a steak knife and 1 a butcher knife. At least 1 hammer, possibly 2. The victims were bound with medical and electrical tape. The attack was sustained, vicious, personal. Sue was found nude from the waist down, gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear secured with tape. She'd been stabbed in the chest, her throat cut so deeply it passed through her larynx and nicked her spine. On the side of her head was an imprint matching the butt of a Daisy 880 Powerline BB/pellet rifle. John's throat had been slashed. Dana had suffered multiple head injuries from blunt force trauma and had been manually strangled to death. Autopsies would later determine that Sue and John died from the combination of knife wounds and blunt force trauma. Dana died from asphyxiation. He'd been strangled to death. Blood spatter reached the ceiling. The living room of Cabin 28 had become a slaughterhouse. And then there was Tina. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was gone. Not dead in the cabin with her mother and brother. Just gone. The rain falls harder now, as if the sky itself is weeping for what happened in that cabin. Somehow, impossibly, Rick and Greg and Justin, the 3 young boys sleeping in the back bedroom, were unharmed. They claimed to have slept through everything, though Justin would later give conflicting accounts that would complicate the investigation for decades. By dawn on Sunday, April 12, 1981, the killers had left. The cabin sat silent. Inside, 3 bodies lay in the living room. Outside, the Keddy Resort was waking up to what should have been an ordinary spring morning. At around 7 o'clock or 7:45 a.m., accounts vary, Sheila Sharp woke at the Seabolt residence. The family invited her to join them for church. She just needed to run next door to change into her Sunday clothes. Sheila walked the few feet from cabin 27 to cabin 28. She opened the front door, and her life changed forever. 14-year-old Sheila Sharp would spend the rest of her life trying to unsee what she saw when she opened that door. The first thing was probably the smell, the metallic, overwhelming scent of blood. Then her eyes adjusted to the dim interior of the cabin, curtains drawn, and she saw them. 3 bodies on the floor of the living room. John, Dana, a third body covered with a yellow blanket. Blood everywhere, on the floor, splattered on the walls, reaching up to the ceiling. A knife on the floor, bent at such an angle that Sheila at first thought it was an open pocket knife. It wasn't. Sheila screamed. She ran from the cabin, her mind trying to process what couldn't be processed, what shouldn't be real but was. She ran back to the Seabolt cabin, crying, screaming for help. The Seabolts rushed next door with her. They saw what she'd seen, confirmed the horror was real. Someone called the police. In those crucial first moments, in the chaos and shock, Sheila thought about her younger brothers. Rick and Greg were still in the cabin. They needed to get them out before they saw what she'd seen. Somehow, and the details here are somewhat unclear, Rick, Greg, and Justin were gotten out of the cabin through a bedroom window. They didn't see the crime scene. They were protected from that, at least. The rain in our story falls steadily as we picture the scene that followed. Police arriving at this remote mountain community, stepping into cabin 28, confronting a level of violence that would haunt even experienced investigators. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department responded. Officers cordoned off the area. Detectives began processing the scene. And as they worked, a horrifying realization emerged. One of Sue's children was missing. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, was not among the bodies. She wasn't anywhere in the cabin. Where was she? The FBI initially became involved, treating Tina's disappearance as a possible abduction. Search teams combed the surrounding forest, covering a 5-mile radius around cabin 28. Police canines were brought in. Volunteers searched day after day, but there was no sign of Tina. Had she been taken by the killers? Had she witnessed what happened and been abducted to prevent her from identifying them? Or had she somehow escaped into the woods, injured or terrified, hiding somewhere beyond reach? As investigators processed the cabin, they documented the weapons left behind. A steak knife, a butcher knife bent from the force used in the attack. One hammer, the medical tape and electrical cords that had bound the victims. Blood spatter patterns that told a story of sustained violence. Conspicuously, for such a brutal crime scene, there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had entered cabin 28 had either been let in, or had used a key, or had found an unlocked door. The cabin hadn't been ransacked. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. This wasn't a robbery or a burglary gone wrong. This was personal, targeted. A crime of rage and violence directed specifically at this family. The rain continues as investigators work through the night and into the next day, photographing, collecting, trying to make sense of the senseless. Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas, the same sheriff who had previously lived in cabin 28, took initial charge of the investigation. Detectives began the painstaking work of interviewing potential witnesses. Several people reported seeing a green van parked near the Sharp cabin around 9:00 p.m. on the night of the murders. Who owned it? Who had been inside? The people who had picked up John and Dana when they hitchhiked back to Quincy were located and interviewed. Could they have followed the boys back to Ketty? Could they have been the killers? The theory seemed plausible. Maybe John and Dana had unknowingly let their killers into the cabin. But as investigators dug deeper, another scenario emerged. The violence was too personal, too sustained, too rage-filled to be random strangers. And the target seemed clear, Sue Sharp. She was the adult, the head of household. John and Dana had likely walked in on the attack, becoming victims themselves when they tried to intervene. Attention turned to the neighbors, to Martin Smart and John Bubaid, living just 2 cabins away, to the tensions between Sue and Martin, to Bo's rejected advances toward Sue, to Marilyn's claims that the two men had been angry the night of the murders. Both Martin and Bo were brought in for questioning. They gave their statements. They claimed they'd been at the backdoor bar, then gone home to sleep. They passed polygraph tests, a fact that would later be controversial as polygraphs are notoriously unreliable. Based on these tests, they were cleared as suspects. But investigators noted something Martin had said. He claimed he'd lost or misplaced a hammer from his cabin. A hammer. One of the murder weapons used in Cabin 28 had been a hammer, and only one hammer had been recovered from the scene. Where was the second hammer Martin mentioned? The rain falls harder now as the investigation begins to run into obstacles. Evidence that should have been collected isn't. Leads that should have been followed aren't. Questions that should have been asked go unasked. 3 months into the investigation, Sheriff Thomas resigned. He took a job with the Sacramento Department of Justice instead. His handling of the Ketty case would later be described by his own successor as disastrous at best and corrupt at worst. Years later, survivors and investigators would allege that Thomas had told suspects to get out of town, essentially letting them escape justice. Whether this was incompetence or cover-up would become one of the many questions surrounding the case. By April 29, 1981, less than 3 weeks after the murders, the FBI reported that they had backed off the search for Tina. They stated that California's Department of Justice was doing an adequate job and that the FBI's presence was no longer necessary. The decision seemed premature, but it stood. Months passed, then years. Tina Sharp remained missing. Hope of finding her alive faded. The case grew cold, and the truth of what happened in Cabin 28 seemed destined to remain forever hidden. But the rain that falls in this story, like the truth, has a way of eventually bringing hidden things to the surface. For 3 years, the question haunted everyone who'd known the Sharp family. What happened to Tina? Her siblings, scattered now to different homes and families, wondered. Sheila, who discovered the bodies, carried the trauma of that morning everywhere she went. Rick and Greg, the younger boys who'd slept through the attack, grew up knowing their mother, brother, and friend had been murdered just rooms away while they slept. The weight of survival, the guilt of being spared, these became their constant companions. The community of Ketty was forever changed. The murders marked the beginning of the end for the resort. Paranoid tourists, hearing about the brutal, unsolved killings, stopped coming. Families who could afford to leave moved away. The cabins fell further into disrepair. What had been a struggling but functioning community began its slow transformation into a ghost town. Investigators continued working the case, but leads grew scarce. Martin Smart had left Ketty, moving to Reno, Nevada, shortly after the murders. Bo Bubaid had also left, reportedly returning to Chicago. Both had been cleared by their polygraph tests, and without physical evidence connecting them to the crime scene, there was no basis for arrest. The rain in our story matches the rain that fell on those abandoned cabins year after year as the case grew colder. Then, on April 22, 1984, 3 years and 11 days after the murders, a man collecting bottles in the woods near Feather Falls in Butte County made a discovery. He was about 60 miles from Ketty, in a remote area near Camp 18, when he found what appeared to be part of a human skull, the cranium portion along with part of a mandible. He alerted authorities. The remains were collected and sent for forensic analysis. In June 1984, a forensic pathologist confirmed what investigators had suspected. The remains belonged to 12-year-old Tina Sharp. Along with the skull, investigators found other items. A pair of Levi's jeans with one pocket missing, a child's blanket, a blue jacket, an empty dispenser of surgical tape, the same kind of medical tape that had been used to bind the victims in Cabin 28. The medical examiner determined that Tina had died sometime after November 1, 1981, at least 6 months after the murders in the cabin. She had been kept alive for months. The cause of her death couldn't be determined due to advanced decomposition, but there was no doubt she'd been murdered. This revelation changed everything. Tina hadn't died in Cabin 28. She'd been abducted, held somewhere for months, and then killed and dumped in the woods miles away. Why? What had she witnessed that made her abductor keep her alive so long before ultimately killing her? What had those months been like for a 12-year-old girl, held captive, knowing her mother and brother were dead? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. Then came something even stranger. Shortly after the announcement that Tina's remains had been identified, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous phone call. The caller's voice, gender indeterminate, asked a specific question. "I was wondering if they thought of the murder up in Ketchup in Plumas County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found?" The caller seemed to know specific details about the case. They knew Tina had been missing. They knew she was 12. They knew she'd never been found. And this was before her identification had been widely publicized. Who was the caller? How did they know? Were they involved? Were they trying to provide information without identifying themselves? Or was this someone with guilty knowledge, unable to stay completely silent? The call should have been a major break in the case. It should have been investigated immediately, the tape analyzed, the information followed up. But incredibly, it wasn't. The call was documented but not pursued. The tape was filed away in an evidence box, where it would sit forgotten for nearly 3 decades. The rain falls steadily as we contemplate these missed opportunities, these inexplicable failures of investigation. By the mid-1980s, the Ketty murders had become one of California's most infamous unsolved cases. Articles were written in local papers, theories circulated, but no arrests were made. No charges were filed. Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid, the prime suspects, remained free. Both had left California and showed no signs of returning. In 2000, Martin Smart died in Oregon at the age of 63. Whatever he knew about the murders died with him. In 1988, Bo Bubaid reportedly died in Chicago. With both main suspects dead, it seemed the case might never be solved. But the case file remained open, and in 2004, Cabin 28, the scene of the horrific murders, was demolished, along with most of the other cabins at Ketty Resort. The physical crime scene was destroyed, but the questions remained. The rain in our story continues, as persistent as the investigators who refused to let the case die. In 2013, more than 30 years after the murders, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg made a decision. They were reopening the Ketty case. Hagwood had a personal connection to the victims. He'd been 16 years old at the time of the murders. He'd known John Sharp and Dana Wingate, had worked with them the entire summer before they were killed. The case had haunted him for decades. "I knew the 2 boys who were murdered," Hagwood told reporters. "I worked with them the entire summer before the murders." Gamberg, too, had known Dana. "Dana was at my house the day before the homicide," he said. Now, decades later, with modern forensic technology and fresh eyes, they believed the case could finally be solved. But what they found when they began reviewing the evidence shocked them. The rain falls as we imagine these 2 men opening dusty evidence boxes, discovering what should have been discovered decades earlier. First, they found the tape of the anonymous phone call about Tina. It had been sitting at the bottom of an evidence box, never properly investigated, never admitted as evidence. Someone had known something about Tina's disappearance and location, but that knowledge had never been pursued. Then they found a letter. In March of 1981, just before the murders, Martin Smart had written to his wife Marilyn while he was in Reno. The letter discussed their marriage troubles, and it ended with a line that seemed to be a confession. "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives. For people's lives. Sue, John, Dana, and Tina, the exact 4 victims of the Ketty murders." When shown the letter decades later, Marilyn Smart said she didn't remember receiving it. But she confirmed it was Martin's handwriting. The letter had been overlooked in the original investigation, never admitted as evidence. How had such a damning piece of evidence been missed? Special Investigator Gamberg later told reporters, "You could take someone just coming out of the academy, and they'd have done a better job. But there was more." A counselor whom Martin Smart had regularly visited in Reno came forward, decades after the fact. to say that Martin had confessed to the murders during a therapy session in May 1981, just weeks after the killings. According to the counselor, Martin had said, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." Martin allegedly told the counselor that Tina was killed to prevent her from identifying him, as she had witnessed the whole thing. When this confession was reported to the Department of Justice in 1981, they had dismissed it as hearsay. The counselor's testimony was never properly documented or pursued. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't just an unsolved case. It was a case where evidence had been ignored, leads not followed, confessions dismissed. Whether through incompetence or something more sinister, the original investigation had failed at almost every level. The rain falls harder now, as if trying to wash away the stain of these failures. In 2016, Gamberg and Hagwood made another discovery. Using a metal detector, they found a hammer in a pond near where the Smart cabin had stood. The hammer matched the description of the one Martin Smart had claimed to have lost in April 1981, the second murder weapon that had never been recovered from cabin 28. The hammer was sent for DNA testing. Along with other pieces of evidence from the original crime scene, the new forensic analysis revealed DNA profiles. Some belonged to the victims. Some were from unidentified individuals. In 2018, investigators announced that DNA from a piece of tape found at the crime scene had been linked to a living, unidentified suspect. But even with DNA evidence, even with the confession to the counselor, even with the letter, even with the hammer, prosecutors didn't feel they had enough to bring charges. Martin Smart was dead. Bo Bubaid was dead. The unidentified DNA didn't match anyone in the system. And without living suspects to prosecute, the case remained technically unsolved. In interviews, both Hagwood and Gamberg have expressed their belief that the case is solvable. They believe they know who committed the murders. They've stated publicly that Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid were responsible. But believing and proving in a court of law are two different things. The rain begins to slow as we reach the present day, where the case remains open, the evidence continues to be analyzed, and hope persists that someday, somehow, justice will be served. Marilyn Smart, Martin's ex-wife, gave interviews in 2008 stating her belief that both Martin and Bo were responsible for the killings. She claimed she found Tina's bloody jacket in her basement after the murders and turned it over to police, though there's no official record of this happening. She also stated that Martin had hated John Sharp and that on the night of the murders, she'd awakened around 2 a.m. to find Martin and Bo burning something in the wood stove. Why didn't Marilyn come forward sooner? Why didn't she tell everything she knew decades earlier? These questions have no satisfying answers. Perhaps she was afraid. Perhaps she didn't want to believe her husband capable of such horror. Perhaps she was protecting herself and her son Justin. Justin Smart, the boy who'd been in cabin 28 that night, who'd slept in the back bedroom with Rick and Greg, has given conflicting accounts over the years. First, he claimed to have slept through everything. Then he said he'd had a strange dream where he witnessed the murders. Under hypnosis, he provided descriptions that allowed police to create composite sketches of potential suspects. But his changing stories have made it difficult to know what he truly saw or remembers. The trauma of that night, compounded by the knowledge that his stepfather was a prime suspect. These burdens have shaped Justin's entire life in ways outsiders can barely imagine. Today, Keddie is little more than a ghost town. The resort is abandoned, the cabins demolished. Only a few buildings remain, weathered, boarded up, silent sentinels of a community that once was. The rain in our story falls on these empty structures, on the lot where cabin 28 once stood, on a place where tragedy transformed into legend and memory. Tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the dark fame of the unsolved murders. True crime enthusiasts make pilgrimages to see where it happened. The case has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, books, articles. In 2005, filmmaker Josh Hancock released a two-part documentary called Cabin 28, The Keddie Murders, featuring interviews with survivors, investigators, and people connected to the case. In 2017, a poorly received horror film called Cabin 28 attempted to dramatize the murders, but it was criticized for exploiting tragedy without adding insight or honoring the victims. The survivors, Sheila, Rick, and Greg Sharp, have all spoken publicly over the years about their struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, about the challenges of moving forward after such devastating loss, about the frustration of seeing their family's tragedy remain unsolved. Sheila Sharp, now in her 50s, has been particularly vocal. She's advocated for justice, pushed for the investigation to continue, spoken to reporters about what she believes happened. In 2016, she told CBS Sacramento, "I was told the suspects were told to get out of town, so to me, that means it was covered up. The rain begins to fade as we honor the memory of those who died." Sue Sharp was 36 years old. She'd left an abusive marriage to build a better life for her children. She'd enrolled in classes, worked multiple jobs, encouraged a neighbor to leave her own abusive situation. She'd been a survivor trying to help another survivor. She deserved to see her children grow up. She deserved the peaceful life she was working toward. John Sharp was 15, a teenager on the cusp of adulthood. He had friends, a future, dreams we'll never know about. He died trying to protect his mother. Dana Wingate was 17, a loyal friend who'd spent countless hours at the Sharp cabin, who'd become like family. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his attempt to help cost him his life. Tina Sharp was 12 years old. Whatever she witnessed that night led to her abduction. For months, at least 6 months, she was held somewhere. Tina Sharp was 12 years old. Whatever she witnessed that night led to her abduction. For months, at least 6 months, she was held somewhere, kept alive for reasons we can only imagine with horror. When she was finally killed and dumped in the woods, she was denied even the dignity of a proper burial for 3 years. These were real people, not characters in a story, not subjects of speculation, but human beings with hopes and fears and lives that mattered. They deserve to be remembered not just for how they died, but for who they were. The rain has stopped now, leaving only the quiet of the mountain night. In 2021, authorities announced they were conducting new DNA testing on evidence from the case, using genealogical DNA analysis, the same technique that solved the Golden State Killer case. This method compares DNA from crime scenes with genetic information in genealogy databases, potentially identifying suspects through their relatives. As of 2024, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests have been made. No one has been charged. But the investigation continues. Evidence is still being tested. Tips are still being followed up. Sheriff Hagwood and Special Investigator Gamberg, now both retired from their positions but still connected to the case, have stated their belief that the murders were committed by Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid, with possible assistance from others. Whether the case will ever be officially closed with arrests and convictions remains uncertain. But for the survivors, for the community of Plumas County, for everyone who's followed this case for more than 4 decades, there's a need for resolution. Not just to satisfy curiosity, but to honor the dead, to acknowledge what happened, to say their names and remember them truly. And so we come to the end of our journey to Ketty, though the story itself has no ending yet. The mystery remains. The questions persist. And for people who should have lived long, full lives remain frozen in memory at the ages they were when violence took them away. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Sue Sharp and her determination to build a better life. For John and Dana, teenagers who tried to be heroes. For Tina, a child who suffered in ways we can barely comprehend. Remember them as people, not just as victims. Honor their humanity, not just their tragedy. The Ketty murders remind us that evil can happen anywhere, even in a small mountain community where neighbors knew each other's names. They remind us that justice delayed is often justice denied, that investigations matter, that the work of solving crimes requires dedication and competence and integrity. They remind us that families left behind carry these losses forever, that there's no statute of limitations on grief. But they also remind us that people don't give up, that investigators like Hagwood and Gamberg, decades later, still care enough to pursue the truth, that communities remember, that survivors speak out, that even cold cases can warm again when dedication and new technology intersect. Perhaps tomorrow will be the day that genealogical DNA finally identifies the unidentified profile from the evidence. Perhaps a deathbed confession will emerge. Perhaps someone who's been silent for 4 decades will finally decide to speak. Perhaps justice, long delayed, will finally arrive for Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. Or perhaps the case will remain forever in that liminal space between solved and unsolved, where investigators know who did it but can't prove it in court, where evidence exists but isn't quite enough, where truth is known but justice remains elusive. Either way, we can choose to remember. We can choose to honor. We can choose to hope that someday, somehow, the full truth will emerge and the people responsible will be held accountable, even if only in the court of history. The rain has stopped. The mountains are quiet. And somewhere in the darkness, the answers to what really happened on April 11th, 1981, in Cabin 28 wait to be discovered. Thank you for listening tonight. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime content that honors the victims and seeks understanding without sensationalism. Sleep well, rest peacefully, and remember that even in stories without endings, there is value in the telling, dignity in the remembering, and hope in the seeking of truth. Good night. This story is told with profound respect for Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp. May their memories be honored. May their surviving family members find peace, and may justice, however long delayed, eventually prevail. Story 3. Good evening and welcome. Whether you're settling down in Belgium, France, Germany, Argentina, California, Texas, or finding rest elsewhere around the world, thank you for being here tonight. Listen, can you hear that gentle rain falling in the distance? Tonight, that rain will accompany us as we journey to Philadelphia in the mid-1980s, where rain once fell on dark streets and unanswered questions. Before we begin, if you appreciate these carefully researched stories designed for peaceful rest, please consider subscribing. Tonight, we travel to Frankfurt, a working-class neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia, once a thriving community known for its music scene and bustling shops. By the 1980s, it had become a place where economic hardship and the crack cocaine epidemic had taken their toll. It was here, along Frankfurt Avenue and under the elevated train tracks, that a killer stalked women for 5 years. Between August 1985 and April 1990, at least 8 women were murdered, sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, their bodies posed in abandoned buildings and alleys. The media gave the killer a name, the Frankfurt Slasher. But despite witness descriptions, police sketches, and a massive investigation, the case would end not with justice, but with controversy. An innocent man likely convicted, the real killer never caught, and 8 families left without answers. So settle deeper into your pillows, listen to the rain, take a slow, calming breath, and let's explore one of Philadelphia's most troubling unsolved cases. The rain falls softly as we begin our story on the morning of August 26, 1985. Transit workers at the SEPTA train yard in Philadelphia, at Penn and Bridge Streets in the Frankfurt section of the city, made a terrible discovery around 8:30 a.m. Between rows of stacked railroad ties lay the body of a woman, nude from the waist down, posed in a sexually provocative position with her legs open and her blouse pulled up to expose her breasts. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly, 47 times, so violently that her internal organs were exposed. By the next day, investigators had identified her, Helen Patton, 52 years old, who lived in Parkland, Pennsylvania, a town in nearby Bucks County. Helen's former husband, Kermit Patton, identified the body. Though they were no longer married, they still lived together in their Bucks County home, leading separate lives. Helen had left the week before without mentioning where she was going. Not unusual for her, Kermit said. Those who knew Helen around Frankfurt were surprised to learn she even had a home outside the city. The rain continues as we picture Helen Patton's final days. She was known to frequent the bars along Frankfurt Avenue, a stretch of working-class establishments where people came to drink, socialize, escape their troubles for a few hours. According to reports, Helen might have met a stranger and been raped and murdered. The newspapers didn't explicitly discuss prostitution at first, but as more murders unfolded, this possibility would be considered. There was no immediate motive, no apparent connection between killer and victim. Just brutal, senseless violence that left investigators with more questions than answers. For months, Helen Patton's murder stood alone, horrific, but perhaps isolated. Then came January 3rd, 1986. Neighbors on Rittner Street in South Philadelphia, 10 miles from the first murder site, were surprised to find 68-year-old Anna Carroll's apartment door standing open. Inside, they found her dead in the bedroom. Like Helen Patton, Anna was nude below the waist, her blouse pushed up. She had been stabbed 6 times, her abdomen slit from sternum to pubis. 2 victims, similar methods, similar posing, but investigators weren't yet publicly linking the cases. Perhaps they hoped these were isolated incidents. Perhaps they didn't want to alarm the public about a potential serial killer. Or perhaps, in a city dealing with rising crime rates and multiple violent offenders, the connections weren't immediately obvious. The rain falls steadily as 1986 progresses, and Frankfurt goes about its daily business, unaware that a predator is walking its streets. Almost a year passed before the killer struck again. On December 25, 1986, Christmas Day, victim number 3 was found. On Richmond Street in the Bridesburg district, 3 miles from Helen Patton's murder scene, worried neighbors found 74-year-old Susan Alzeff's apartment door open. Inside, they discovered her body stabbed 6 times in the back. Like Helen Patton, Susan was a familiar figure on Frankfurt Avenue. 3 victims now, 3 older women, all frequenting the same general area, all killed in similar ways. The police could no longer dismiss these as unrelated incidents. This was a pattern. This was a serial killer. By early 1987, with 4 victims and no end in sight, police officially linked the murders and created a special task force to hunt the man Philadelphia journalists were already calling the Frankfurt Slasher. The name captured something about the crimes, the violence, the cutting, the predatory nature of the attacks. And it captured the public's imagination and fear. Under the elevated train tracks, in the bars and apartments of Frankfurt, people began looking at strangers differently, wondering if the person next to them on a bar stool could be the killer. The next victim came on January 9th, 1987. Jean Durkin was found in her apartment. Another brutal stabbing, another posed body. The details were horrifyingly similar to the previous murders. Then, on May 1st, 1987, came a victim whose case would prove crucial. Lisa Gottschall was found dead, and for the first time, there was a witness. A barmaid on Frankfurt Avenue recalled seeing the victim around 6:30 p.m. the previous day, drinking with a round-faced, middle-aged white man who wore glasses and limped when he walked. Finally, a description. Finally, something concrete. Police worked with sketch artists to create composite drawings of the suspect. A white man, middle-aged, with distinctive features. The sketches were published in newspapers, distributed throughout the neighborhood, shown on local television. But despite the publicity, despite hundreds of tips called in, the suspect remained elusive, and the killings continued. The rain patters gently as we move through 1987 and into 1988, each passing month bringing the possibility of another victim. On July 1988, Deborah Dudley was found murdered. Then, on November 11th, 1988, 66-year-old Marge Vaughn was found dead on Penn Avenue, stabbed 29 times in the vestibule of an apartment building from which she'd been evicted the previous day. She died less than 3 blocks from where Jean Durkin had been found, half a mile from where Helen Patton had been discovered. 7 victims now. The Frankfurt Slasher had been operating for more than 3 years, and the police seemed no closer to catching him. Then came January 19th, 1989, and a murder that would provide investigators with critical evidence. Around 6:45 p.m., neighbors of Teresa Sciortino heard sounds of an apparent struggle inside her apartment, followed shortly by footsteps on the stairs. But they didn't call police until 9 p.m., and the building's manager waited past midnight to check on her. He found her sprawled in her kitchen, nude except for stockings, stabbed 25 times. A bloody footprint at the scene provided homicide investigators with their best lead yet. The footprint. Finally, physical evidence that could potentially identify the killer. Teresa's boyfriend was initially considered a good suspect, but when police checked his shoes, they found them similar but not identical to the killer's. The task force spun its wheels. The months passed. The fear in Frankfurt continued to grow. In the pre-dawn hours of April 28, 1990, Patrolman Dan Johnson was cruising his beat when he saw a woman's nude, eviscerated corpse in the alley behind a Frankfurt Avenue fish market. The victim was Carol Dowd, 46 years old. Like the others, she'd been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. Her body had been posed. She was the 8th victim clearly linked to the Frankfurt slasher. But this time, police had a suspect. Leonard Christopher worked at the nearby fish market. He knew the victim, and when police questioned him, he gave what seemed like an incriminating statement to his boss. The rain continues as we approach one of the most controversial aspects of this entire case. Leonard Christopher was arrested on May 5, 1990, and charged with Carol Dowd's murder. Despite the fact that he did not match the witness descriptions of Dowd being seen with a middle-aged white man before her death, and that there was no evidence linking him to any of the other 8 murders, and only circumstantial evidence linking him to Dowd's murder, he was tried and convicted. The case against Christopher was thin. 2 witnesses, described as drug addicts and prostitutes with extensive criminal records, claimed to have seen Christopher with Dowd in an alley shortly before her death. One reported hearing a scream and seeing him leave with blood on his clothing and a knife. But defense attorney Jack McMahon argued that the testimonies were unreliable. At least one witness had admitted to lying under oath in prior cases. No forensic evidence connected Christopher to the murder. No blood, no DNA, no murder weapon at the scene or on his person. Police found no injuries on Christopher consistent with a recent struggle. Most significantly, Christopher was a black man. All of the eyewitness accounts from previous murders had described a middle-aged white man. How could Christopher be the Frankfurt slasher when he didn't match the physical description given by multiple witnesses? The trial proceeded in December 1990. After 4 hours of deliberations, the jury convicted Christopher of first-degree murder. Several jurors were visibly upset. Christopher showed no visible reaction, but his defense attorney shook his head in disbelief. Although prosecutors asked for the death penalty, Christopher was sentenced to life in prison. He maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest, referring to himself as having been railroaded by pipers, prostitutes coerced into testifying by police. But here's what makes this case truly troubling. In September 1990, while Christopher was in jail awaiting trial, a 9th woman was killed. Michelle Denner, 30, was found murdered behind a seafood market near Frankfurt Avenue, with multiple stab wounds to the neck, chest, and abdomen, mirroring the patterns of the previous victims. The Frankfurt slasher had struck again, while the man convicted of being the slasher was safely locked up in jail. Police classified Denner's murder as a copycat killing. The jury was never told about it. Christopher was convicted anyway. The rain falls harder now, as if trying to wash away the stain of injustice. Leonard Christopher spent the rest of his life in prison, maintaining his innocence until his death from cancer behind bars. According to Marissa Bluestein from the Innocence Project of Pennsylvania, this is a man who spent the majority of his life in a prison cell for a crime that he did not commit, in a way that bothered him more than the fact that his freedom had been taken away. In recent years, investigators have revisited the case with fresh eyes and modern technology. Investigators have since determined there is no evidence supporting Leonard Christopher as the Frankfurt slasher. 8 cases remain open and unsolved. All the victims were Caucasian, lived in the area, and had a history of mental illness or drug dependency. They were women on the edges of society, Bluestein said. These were vulnerable women, easy targets for a predator who knew they wouldn't be immediately missed, whose murders might not receive the full attention of law enforcement. The Frankfurt neighborhood lived in fear during those 5 years. Residents adopted heightened vigilance, routinely scrutinizing strangers in local bars and on streets. This atmosphere of suspicion eroded everyday social interactions, substituting communal routines with individual precautions. Walt Hunter, a longtime Philadelphia reporter who covered the slayings, remembered, "The people who lived in Frankfurt would find themselves looking at the person next to them on the bar stool or coming down the street." According to some reports, the slasher posed as a counselor offering guidance and consolation, even renting an office in a nearby church where he would befriend women in bars. But after they left with him, they were never seen alive again. Detectives created composite sketches. They were closing in on a prime suspect when he disappeared, moving to another state. The murders abruptly stopped. Then, years later, police received word that their prime suspect had died. The 8 murder cases remain technically open and unsolved, and with the death of the prime suspect, many details of the brutal murders may remain forever a mystery. Who was this prime suspect? His name has never been publicly released. Whether he was truly the Frankfurt slasher or just another false lead, we may never know. In 2019, Philadelphia police announced they were re-examining existing DNA evidence with modern technology, hoping to finally solve the case. But as of 2024, no arrests have been made, no charges filed. The Frankfurt slasher, whoever he was, got away with murder. 8 women died: Helen Patent, 52, Anna Carroll, 68, Susan Alzef, 74, Jean Durkin, Lisa Gottschall, Deborah Dudley, Marge Vaughn, 66, Teresa Ciartino, and possibly Michelle Denner, 30, the 9th victim whose murder occurred while Leonard Christopher sat in jail. These women had names, had lives, had people who loved them. They weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were human beings whose lives were cut short by violence and whose deaths remain officially unsolved. Leonard Christopher also had a life. He had a job, relationships, dreams of freedom. He spent decades in prison for a crime he almost certainly didn't commit, dying without ever clearing his name, forever associated with murders he had nothing to do with. The rain begins to slow, as if the sky has run out of tears. And so we come to the end of the Frankfurt slasher story. Though like all unsolved cases, it has no real ending. Just questions that linger, victims who deserve justice, and a man who paid for crimes he didn't commit. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for the women of Frankfurt, for Helen and Anna and Susan and all the others who crossed paths with evil on those dark streets. Remember them as people, not just victims. Honor their humanity beyond their tragedy. And remember Leonard Christopher, a man who became a scapegoat when police and prosecutors were desperate to close a case that terrified a city. Remember that the rush to justice sometimes tramples justice itself, that the pressure to solve crimes can lead to convicting the wrong person while the real killer walks free. The Frankfurt slasher case reminds us that serial killers often target the most vulnerable in society: women struggling with addiction, mental illness, poverty. Women whom society had already marginalized, whose deaths might not generate the same urgency as victims from different circumstances. It reminds us that every victim deserves the full weight of investigation and justice, regardless of their station in life. It also reminds us that wrongful convictions happen, even in high-profile cases, even when juries believe they're doing the right thing. That eyewitness testimony is fallible. That circumstantial evidence can mislead. That sometimes the obvious answer isn't the right answer. Somewhere in the Philadelphia area, there may be an elderly man who knows exactly what happened on those dark streets between 1985 and 1990. Perhaps he's died, taking his secrets to the grave. Perhaps he's still alive, living with the memories of what he did. Perhaps he sometimes thinks about the women whose lives he took, the terror he caused, the innocent man who was punished in his place. The rain has stopped now. The night is quiet. And the truth about who really stalked the streets of Frankfurt remains hidden in shadows and silence. Thank you for listening tonight. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime content that honors both the victims and the complexity of justice. Sleep well, rest peacefully, and remember that even when cases go unsolved, even when justice fails, we can still choose to remember, to honor, and to hope that someday, somehow, truth will prevail. Good night.